we are going to talk today about the proposal for helping customers implement compliance pipeline templates that allow them to create a baseline standard of what they expect to be run for regulated projects in terms of what's in the pipeline, but still allow developers the flexibility to add to or extend that pipeline. This project started when we deprecated the feature, or at least notified of deprecation for the feature of required pipeline configuration, also dubbed forced includes. And we've primarily been trying to navigate this from the perspective of let's start from scratch, let's do the validation, do the research, and let's make sure that we're really solving the right pain points and problem area. And so after a lot of research over the last couple of months, I'd like to walk you through two different issues or two different proposals, which I think tackle, on one hand, a much better experience, at least between group and project level, on how to provide these compliance pipeline templates that developers aren't entirely trapped by. And then the second issue I want to walk you through talks about the improvements we could make rather than deprecation of required pipeline configuration that could solve for the friction around developers not having any insight into what's going on with this pipeline config they have no insight into or control over, provide them a way to override or escape that process in the event of an emergency, and making sure that we're striking that balance between a great developer experience and ensuring that compliance-minded organizations have what they need to comply with their regulations or internal policies. So let me start with.
Thanks, Matt. Do you mind telling me a little bit more about some of the research that you've done? You said you've done a bunch of research. I know that you've talked to a ton of different customers. Can you kind of just describe maybe a high level you can, the typical profile of the customer that's been asking for this and kind of the messaging that you've heard, if you can summarize it as best you can?
Sure. So the typical profile is a large enterprise who operates at least a few thousand number of projects. They are typically in the premium or ultimate pricing tier, and they have generally a very risk-averse profile in terms of their appetite for risk. They are of the mindset that some of them are of the mindset that they would rather block everything to production than allow even a single bad change. But there are others who say, no, it's okay. We want to empower developers to be able to deploy to certain environments with minimal blockages or gates or interaction from us as the compliance team, but there still do need to be programmatic checks that could block production if it's an egregious non-compliant change. Some of the main highlights have been, an explicit mention of, quote unquote, we're typically more concerned with making an auditor happy than we are with the developers, though we'll try to make developers happy where we can. Another interesting insight was it's far more expensive and time consuming for us to retroactively undo a non-compliant change than it is for us to be a little bit less efficient up front and stop those non-compliant changes from being able to propagate in the first place. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So let me go ahead and jump into this first proposal. So this first proposal essentially relies on parent-child pipelines to be able to enforce, or I shouldn't say, but it is enforcement, right? To be able to define a compliance pipeline template, basically a baseline of stages or jobs that need to run for every project in a regulated group or a regulated project. And so what this does is we would say at the group level, similar to the current required pipeline configuration, we have a project where we can point to, and we say this project contains a template that we define as, here's the baseline requirement. It might have scans or testing or something that the organization has said, here's what has to run for each project that's going to push to a sensitive or regulated production environment. So using parent-child pipelines, that group level definition becomes the parent. The developer then creates a project, which becomes the child pipeline in that equation. And when they set up the project, they can use the custom CI config path to point to this external project with this compliance pipeline definition. Once that relationship is established, then when the project runs, they have this unified pipeline between the parent and child, so group and project level. And then as this pipeline is run, we start realizing that there are opportunities for improvement. And so some of those opportunities are defined down here, where we talk about right now, one of the missing key elements is artifacts between parent and child pipelines. So that's something that we would have to address to make this a viable solution. We would need to implement we call it a reporter plus or reporter deployer role, where the reporter role, which cannot push code or make changes, would be able to play a deploy job. Whereas right now, you have to be developer or maintainer access, which is a conflict for separation of duties, because now the person who can deploy code is also technically capable of pushing code. So that's one of the gaps we'd have to address. Improving the DAG visualization or DAG view for parent-child pipelines, which I know there's a lot of great work being done around that already, but this particular improvement would provide developers with more insight, so that they don't just see, oh, I have an upstream failure, what do I do, what's going on, who do I talk to? It's, oh, I have an upstream failure and I know exactly what's failing and why. And I think that's going to be key to making sure that the developer experience is maintained. But then I think we'll also need to ensure that group owners, or maybe administrators, maybe both, are able to define and restrict this particular setting for custom CI path, because otherwise a maintainer could then change this setting and then you're bypassing that requirement. So these are the gaps that we've identified in this particular proposal, but this at least gets us to a point where customers have said, yes, this solution is what we need. Now that solves for the customer side, right? That's the customer saying, yes, there's buy-in, we like this, we want this solution. That doesn't solve for what I would call the GitLab side, where we want to make sure the developer experience is great, we're not causing a lot of friction, we're not reducing velocity, we're not putting customers in a catastrophic environment or scenario where they can't push an emergency change. And so I have a second proposal then that supplements this one to create this more holistic solution, but I'll pause for a second if you have any questions.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to touch on the question that I had, which is that it looks like I'm able to create. The only thing is I don't have any control over the the parent pipeline, I guess it would be in this case, where it is nice that because we're using parent-child pipelines, I, as a developer who's working in this project, I can manage my CI YAML file in whatever way that I want, but we're able to always enforce that the parent pipeline is being run. But my question naturally became, like, what happens if there's a Sev1 and I need to be able to push an emergency change, and the parent pipeline is now failing for some weird reason because there's like an enforcement or compliance job that is not really related, and for a variety of reasons, and I just need to get this thing merged so I can resolve the Sev1.
Yep.
How do we handle those situations where there's an emergency and I just need to get the thing in?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I know that's kind of the root at why we didn't want to pursue required pipeline configuration. And so I'm glad you asked, Jeremy, because I think I have a solution. So the second proposal essentially says, here are some things that we can do to improve the experience and the functionality of required pipeline configuration rather than deprecate it. Because what we know is that when we announced the deprecation, customers reacted. And you could classify that as like, well, maybe they just don't know what the alternatives are, or maybe we can solve this in a better way. And I think this is solving it in a better way, which is simply iterating on it to make it a better experience. So essentially what I would like to achieve is, first we should remove the deprecation status of this feature. That's my humble opinion. And then we should instead rename it to compliance pipeline template or something similar, because that's what it is, right? It is a template with specific compliance requirements that has been defined at the organizational or maybe department level. And it's going to happen either way, with or without our help. So by making it native, but smooth and developer friendly, I think that's a win. And so then I think it's, there's a little bit of uncertainty on the specifics of exactly how we implement something like a list of approvers, but similar to merge request approvers, there probably needs to be a list of like organizational or security approvers. Some of the work that we're doing for two-person approvals, which is mentioned down here, would require, I think, at least so far in our research, some list of people who are authorized to approve changes to sensitive settings, or as I'll cover in a minute, maybe approve the bypass of this compliance pipeline template. So exploring that particular feature of how do we create this list of users who can then be these authorized personnel to make these decisions, or like be the second set of eyes for certain actions within the application. So we could add, so kind of following that logic, we could add a button to maybe specific jobs in the pipeline, maybe the merge request itself, and that could manifest to say, hey, I need to request an override or request an exception or something. And that could generate notification to this list of users and says, hey, like there's some problem with this pipeline, there's some problem with this merge request, and that empowers them, A, to be notified and aware of the problem, but then to B, to actually act on it. And so rough workflow would be, I make a change, my local pipeline passes, but this compliance pipeline has a failing job, and that job is required to succeed in order for the pipeline to succeed. And so I'm stuck as a developer. Well, but now I have a button that I say, I need to get past this. That sends emails, maybe in-app notification, maybe we leverage an approval queue in the compliance dashboard, maybe all of those things. And that allows this authorized list of people, maybe just admins or group owners, to say, what, it's okay for this to be exempted from our typical workflow because production is down and we need this change to go out. So this basically gives developers we empower developers to take control of that action, or at least some semblance of control, because before they had no recourse, maybe manually engaging with somebody outside of the application. But within the application, we could append information that makes that decision much faster, much easier for the authorized person, right? What is the merge request ID? What is the target and source branch? What's the target environment? How many approvers does it maybe have already? We can append data that we already have and help make that decision much faster, rather than finding Jeremy, briefing Jeremy, and bringing you up to speed, and then like making that decision together. There's an existing feature already for allowing users to override a job result and continue the pipeline. And I think if we take that and iterate on it to be a bit more compliance organization friendly, then I think we essentially have that mechanism, or at least proposed and ready to iterate on. I mentioned earlier that the use of two-person approvals could come into play here, because we're already establishing a paradigm where any user could say, hey, this sensitive project setting, I want to change that, but my organization wants that set the way that it is. So I'm going to request a change. That then goes to an authorized approver. They review that and they say, yes, this is okay to change. And then they're at least aware of what's happening, and then they can change it back once the task is completed. And so I think we can take that paradigm and apply it to this for merge request and or the jobs themselves. I think this process would also allow us to then surface intelligent data within the merge request. So we could show you that, were any of these jobs overridden or exempted? Were there any failures? Who was the authorized approver outside of the merge request approvals who interacted with this? Was there documentation created, let's say like a programmatic issue we created to document this override? Who requested it, who approved it, job, target, all that. And then I think this complements the proposal we just covered. And so I think these two things together satisfy both compliance-minded organizations to say, hey, we want this control. We want to be able to make sure that these regulated projects operate in a certain way according to company policy. But then it also enables developers to say, hey, like there are going to be times when this makes no sense because we are going to be under a time constraint, an emergency, or maybe it just doesn't make sense for a certain project. And I think building in these mechanisms to allow for an override and empowering developers both maintains, their experience, gives them power, gives them visibility, gives them access to make those, to help make those decisions or inform those decisions. But then I think that it creates this more holistic solution that allows developers and organizations to work together to figure out what works for them. So that's where we're at today. We've had plenty of validation, at least on the first proposal. So I think we're good to go there from that perspective. We validated this particular issue with only one customer so far, and the feedback was positive. So we have more validation to do on this particular proposal. But generally speaking, the conversations I've had point to this is a sufficient and positive way to solve for this override aspect of compliance pipelines.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think I agree with the overall approach. I mean, I think it makes sense to have an override, and I like that. We're really focused on thinking about the developer experience and trying to create a balance there. I wonder, there are two things that stand out to me. One, considering the like adding a button so that you're able to override specific jobs, and two, like the potentially leveraging two-person approvals. I wonder if the MVC is just being able to, like you said at one point, just simply an individual is able to go ahead and get like a merge request merged. And the reason that I think that maybe we start this as a very broad override and then like get it focused over time is that it optimizes for the developer experience and for velocity, and B, like thinking about it at the job level, that could harm. I'm trying to think through that experience and what it's like if I see a very complex pipeline. It's like, oh well, this failed. Well, I have the permission. I'm going to override that job. So then the pipeline continues. Oh, it failed again. I need to go back to the notification. Go back to that pipeline. Go ahead and proceed. Oh, it failed again. So then I have to go back to that pipeline a third time, and that could result in a kind of a frustrating experience. So what I defaulted to in my mind was like, maybe we just start with just an overall override. And number two, it's do you feel like the leveraging two-person approvals is something that's important for this type of customer, or maybe do we just start with just like a blessed group of that we could designate a group of like our security compliance team, and that individual could just push a button, and then we generate some type of evidence artifact in like our audit events table to say like, this thing happened. So, and then that merge request can go ahead and proceed. Is the two-person approval like important, or do you feel like maybe we can start with just one person hitting a button?
Yeah, no, that's great feedback and a great question. So I think two-person approvals is important in the long term, but I'm supportive of the more iterative short-term proposal, because some of the sort of side conversations I've had with brainstorming around this has been, maybe we follow. I think it was the secure team who did the vulnerability check approval rule, and so maybe we can do a combination of a compliance check approval rule that's hard coded in some way with logic that allows this approval group or person to take this one-click action. But combined with moving default approvers to the group level as well, so that you can define this role once, and then all of the projects in this group that's regulated or has these requirements, you have this person or team who's capable of coming in. And then at that point, it's maybe just building in a notification mechanism for the developer, because even though the one person would have that one-click action, we still want to make sure the developer feels empowered that they can say, I'm not just stuck. I don't have to just sit here. I can take some action and let everyone in the world know and do the digital mountaintop yell to make sure that I solve this problem that's stopping me.
Yeah, totally agreed. That makes sense to me. So like, let me summarize kind of what I heard. So, GitLab, the application kind of defaults and tries to optimize for the developer experience, but we have like this set of risk-minded enterprises that, especially those that are regulated by some compliance framework, that want to err on the side of making auditors happy. And this is like a large financial company here could be. And so like we have this spectrum kind of like on this side, we have, the developer experience, we're optimizing for throughput and velocity and trying to make that as good as possible. But that's in direct opposition to what some of these enterprises want, which is we want to make sure that every merge, every commit, everything that hits a particular environment, like has these boxes checked, whether that's security scanning or their own kind of compliance kind of, systems that they've kind of set up, and that every single thing is adherent. That's in direct opposition to like the developer experience at times, because implies a level of enforcement that we're putting on every single merge request, and every single commit, really. So, what do we do? Well, it sounds like what you're trying to do is build the ability for enterprises to figure out where they lie on that spectrum, and then have an escape hatch for the experience that we can always default to trying to make the developer experience good. And the default experience that it sounds like you're advocating for is the left-hand side, which is like all these systems that you just described, as far as I heard, are all EE features that are default off, and we have to configure them based off of our own risk appetite.
Correct.
Per company. So I think that makes total sense. I think that you're thinking the right way. We need to consider and always try to protect the developer experience, make sure that we can maintain a high level of velocity. And with that in mind, what I would encourage you to do is, when we think about success criteria as we ship these steps iteratively, is like, let's make sure that we're measuring things like average kind of like throughput for an instance that's using this, pre and post, the average time to merge. Like, if those things are going up to a significant degree, we may want to rethink things. If, like, all of a sudden, an instance is shipping like half the volume merge requests, is taking twice as long to like get stuff into production, then we might want to loosen these restrictions and rethink kind of how we're handling this. But I think that, if we have our eye on some of the success metrics, I think that the philosophy and the roadmap certainly makes sense. There's definitely some unanswered questions that we can kind of work on answering together, but I think I appreciate all the work and research that you've done here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeremy. I agree with all of that. And we are working on some other things in the compliance group, like API-enabled approval rules that could allow customers to customize when some of these checks occur and take some of it out of the pipeline. And so I think we'll be able to provide enough flexibility that they can, balance things in a way that makes sense for them. But that's just to your point of, hey, build the workflows that make sense for you, and we'll be capable of supporting the steps that you need.
There's a question. I'll end on with a question that Sid posed in like a conversation a while back, which was, why can't we just focus on making the auditor happy? Because like, this customer is ultimately trying to create a set of evidence that pleases like their auditor, and they're kind of doing whatever their auditor is asking for. Why can't we approach the auditor and kind of improve like our the evidence that we're creating versus doing what the customer is kind of asking for here? Because ultimately, like, these asks from the customer are based off of their audit and compliance requirements. Sure. So why can't we kind of approach it from that angle?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, actually, because I think that's a really important thing for us to understand as a group and a company. So yes, it is true that customers are trying to make auditors happy, but the auditor comes in and they say, I have no preconceived notion of how I'm going to audit you. So let's look at the scope of your systems, resources, and environment that I'm going to be looking at, and then show me the company policies that I need to then audit against. And so an auditor is going to read, let's say, an SDLC policy, maybe for one company that's 10 steps and another company that's 87 steps. Well, the 87-step SDLC company is going to have a much more thorough audit, because the auditor is going to say, okay, prove to me that you're doing all of these things you say you're doing. And so when it comes to generating evidence, we are working towards multiple, I think 3 or 4 different types of MVCs for different audit reports that we'll build out. And those will generally serve as great foundational evidence artifacts that companies can serve up to their auditors. What that doesn't solve for, though, is that nuance of, we can't make a report that's specific for every company. And we can't make a process or a feature that inherently supports every company. And so we inherently need to provide flexibility, so that if company A says, I only need 10 steps in my process, and so I can easily do that with GitLab, we can do that. But if a company says, well, I have 87 steps and I need to make that possible in GitLab so that I can make my auditor happy when they audit me against my own process and procedure, we have to be able to do that. So I think that those are probably 2 different things. Like, we should be building really comprehensive audit reporting and evidence collection capabilities, but we should also be providing flexibility that enables customers to actually translate their company policy and process to the GitLab application because we've now become an extension of their business.
Cool. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. A lot more to talk about, but I think we can flip the recording up from here. And thanks for the great conversation.
Cool. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks.